In the first year of my PhD, I did a research philosophy course. It was a mandatory part of my doctoral training, and I just couldn't understand why I had to give a flip about what Kant, Descartes, Hume, Locke, and a bunch of other boring men were talking about. I was like, okay, I need to get my assumptions in check. But why do I need to read this stuff? And how does it link with my research exactly? I didn't understand it then immediately, and it took me a while. But here's what I found out later, which made my research and ability to do research infinitely stronger. I will tell you how philosophy can help you as a researcher and give you some practical advice about what and how you can read philosophy. Most humans philosophize unknowingly. We all hold certain views and assumptions of the world and our realities. And a lot of us also question widely held assumptions. Is there really one true reality? Does reality only ever exist in our heads and in our thoughts? Do we have free will? Our areas of research interest generally reflect our personal philosophy without us even realizing. So alignment between philosophical assumptions and our research interests tend to occur as a natural progression. For instance, those of you who see the world as composed of single truths might want to do research which seeks these kinds of truths through the use of scientific methods. Or if you believe that reality is experienced through our interactions with each other, then you might want to research human subjects. These assumptions that we as individuals hold not only come before our research, but also inform our research interests. But we tend to live in a pretty homogeneous world where most of us tend to hold similar beliefs and assumptions. The two beliefs that I just described are the two most common ways that people think about the world. There are hardcore measurable facts, or everything just exists in our heads and there is no truth. It's almost as though these are the only two paradigms that exist, and there is no other way to think, or no other assumptions that can be held. This is where reading philosophy can strengthen your research. By opening yourself up to different kinds of assumptions and beliefs that are available, you can produce different kinds of knowledge, and you can produce knowledge differently. It also gives you ways to think differently about existing research, which can then help you form interesting critiques about such research. For instance, my own research did not actually identify any research gap as such. It has mostly been produced through a critique of the existing research, which are largely informed by positivist and interpretivist paradigms. And this critique was only made possible because I went ahead and read new materialist philosophy. If I've convinced you by now that engaging with philosophy during your PhD can be and actually is integral to developing your research and producing your becoming as a researcher, then the question you might be asking yourself is, what philosophy should I read? A couple of weeks ago, I shared this stack of philosophy books that I've collected over the past few years in a reel on Instagram. That post brought in loads of comments from philosophy graduates and, well, philosophy pros as ordained by academic institutions. They basically think, or so they assume, that they know all about philosophy and reading philosophy and the correct structure to reading philosophy because they have a certificate that says they went to philosophy school. Someone went as far as commenting, as a philosophy graduate, you pick the weirdest to get into. That is their assumption that there are weird books to get into, or that there is a one right set of philosophy books. With my own journey with philosophy, as I mentioned earlier, I was first introduced to people like Plato, Aristotle, Hume, and so on. And while I did engage fleetingly with these texts, my real interest in philosophy started when I was reading around my research topic. And these papers kept referring to certain philosophical discussions. For instance, I was reading about how organizational processes work, and they kept talking about Albert North Whitehead's process philosophy. I was reading about how research in information systems was moving towards the theory of sociomateriality. And in reading about this theory, I was constantly being thrown into discussions about relational ontology and Karen Barad's work on agential realism. I was constantly falling from one rabbit hole to the other, most of which were philosophical in nature to an extent, and I didn't seem to mind it. So I kept engaging with these texts and thoughts And over the last few years, I seemed to have embarked on my own unguided philosophical journey. What I want you to take from here is that philosophical discussions are there in most papers, although perhaps they are at the fringes. I could have ignored the couple of sentences that talked about relationality and process philosophy in papers related to my research, but I didn't. I wanted to know more than just the surface level understanding about these things because they challenged my worldviews. The key thing that I want you to take away from this is that your philosophical journey does not need to have a strict structure or curriculum as such, although I will provide some structure in just a minute. You can jump into philosophical ideas related to your research and find connected ideas. Keep jumping in and out of rabbit holes, and importantly, remember that they are not holes necessarily. They are burrows. They are connected to each other. Most philosophical ideas will relate to others because philosophers in their texts reference other philosophical works. But if you're someone wanting structure and too much freedom paralyzes you, then you can start with the basics. My own philosophy journey was influenced quite heavily by Western philosophy. It's just where I found myself in, but this does not mean that non-Western philosophers aren't good. I just won't be able to give you any guidance or recommendations on that, as I do not have very much background on them. So the recommendations that I will provide are centered around Western philosophy. Perhaps one of the easiest books that you can read to start getting a feel for philosophy is The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. Russell himself is an analytic philosopher and a logician, so his philosophy is actually pretty recent. But this book, I think, does a pretty good job at actually introducing some of the basics of philosophy, especially because unlike most philosophy texts, it's written in a very easy to read manner for just everyday people like us. And he presents ideas from the likes of Descartes, Kant, Plato in an accessible manner, which will then allow you to pretty easily grasp some of the basic philosophical ideas. He does not necessarily go in a chronological order, but I don't disagree with his choice of presentation, as I really don't think that chronology is always as important in learning philosophy as everybody seems to think it is. Once you start to warm up to some basic philosophical ideas with Russell's book, I recommend you pick certain threads or philosophical ideas that you enjoyed in his book and explore them further. But if you still can't seem to settle on any threads yourself, then you can still approach philosophical texts chronologically. So you start with reading works by some foundational philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. You can then move on to reading some modern philosophy like Descartes, Kant, and Francis Bacon. Here you might find that Descartes' Meditations is especially interesting as it focuses on epistemological problems. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge and how we know what we know. And throughout time, there have been philosophers who have questioned whether it is possible to have any knowledge at all. So especially for researchers and PhD students who are invested in the knowledge production process, I highly recommend Meditations for your philosophy journey. David Hume's book, An Inquiry into Human Understanding, similarly is a great book that you can read for further debates into questions such as where do ideas come from, how do we understand things. He also discusses the notion of cause and effect, and I think it's really important if you're a researcher whose knowledge claims are based on links between cause and effect. So again, great book for digging into some epistemological debates. After familiarizing yourself with classic and modern philosophy, you can delve into contemporary philosophy, where you can read either analytic or continental philosophy, or of course both. I have read more continental philosophy than analytic philosophy, but again, that's just what I found myself in. I will make another video for recommendations about contemporary philosophy, but if you take the route that I have recommended, it is likely that by this point you will start carving your own philosophical path. Now, a few tips for starting your philosophy reading journey to wrap up this video. First, because philosophy books are so dense, you need to skim short parts, be it a chapter, a paragraph, or a page, and then you make your way through it again very slowly. So you essentially skim and grind. The idea is that you get a general feel of what's being said, and then you closely read it to give the argument a clearer shape. So you need to be patient and you need to be disciplined. But most importantly, you need to engage in active and slow reading. You should also learn to float and focus. That is, on your first read, you should expect that you will understand nothing. So it's really difficult and you merely just float. Then slowly the text starts feeling more comprehensible, and so you very slowly start to focus on it. And you basically switch between merely floating through some bits and focusing on certain bits as you move along. Next, when you read, do not give in to the urge to stop reading. You will want to stop reading because it's hard and it will feel like you're wasting time. But giving into your urges is only going to make it harder. You just need to knuckle down, set a timer for 25 to 30 minutes, and keep going. It gets easier with time. During every reading session, highlight and annotate your texts, but do not do it as you read. Wait until you finish reading each paragraph, page, or section. Otherwise, you will find that you highlight every sentence, and that is honestly the most unproductive thing that you will ever do during your reading sessions. Waiting until you're done with a section allows you to take notes of only the most important bits so they stand out to your future self at a later date. Finally, after each chapter, summarize the main argument in your own words. Teach yourself what you have just read in simple words and sentences. You might not be able to do this immediately, but that's okay. It is common not to understand hard text in the first go. It's not fiction where once you've read it, you'll never come back to it. Expect to read hard philosophical texts multiple times before you're able to grasp something. This is not a short hack for doing better research. It is a lengthy process that requires dedication and commitment. But once you get to grips with it, I can testify that your abilities to produce research and make coherent, strong arguments does significantly enhance. I only started reading philosophy seriously in the first year of my PhD, but I honestly wish I had started reading sooner. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and that I have convinced you to embark on your philosophy journey. If you learned something from this video, give it a like and hit subscribe for more. See you next time.